So, welcome to this Allora Research Fireside Chat. So, today we're going to explore the ideas shaping decentralized machine intelligence and AI on a topic that blends psychology, design, and ethics. So, we're looking at how emotional intelligence and personality expression can be integrated into AI agents to make them more trustworthy, relatable, and effective. Well, in a future populated by countless AI agents, the personality expression won't just enhance user experience, it's going to help prevent homogeneity and enable agents to evolve distinct adaptive roles. I'm joined today by Diederik, our head of research, who's been leading Allora's research on this topic and has recently published a paper. So, good afternoon, Diederik.
Good afternoon, Steve.
So I think we're all familiar in general terms with what emotional intelligence is. So I guess you know what knowing and managing your own emotions, understanding other people's emotions, and I guess the idea of empathy and why that's really important in managing relations. Or social skills are really key for us and determines how successful all of our social interactions are, which is a vital part of how we live. So we understand that in a human perspective, but why do you think emotional intelligence is important for AI?
Well, I think that has a lot of parallels to why it is important also for humans. In humans, I think specifically emotional intelligence, and that'll get to personalities as well. The reason that has evolved is largely because we're a very social species. So basically, in order to function and make sure that we interact well in this sort of very social infrastructure and culture and community that we exist in, emotional intelligence has been a source of just great evolutionary fitness, so to say. And the moment you start using AI in human interactions, the ability of that AI to function is going to require similar degrees of emotional intelligence. Otherwise, for the human user, it is not an acceptable point of reference or conversation partner. It might not be a reliable resource, and so on. And there is an enormous amount of scientific literature on this. Is actually it goes back at least a decade, where basically the first forms of AI, even like simple chatbots and so on, were already tested on how their emotional intelligence or how their personality expression impacted for instance, the trust that users would place in these chatbots or interlocutors. And what is found basically in all of these studies is that the trust that people place in the AI as just being reliable, providing useful information, being helpful, or in general just being sympathetic is very directly related to what these people expect of somebody they would be speaking with in the real world. And what people expect is often very related just to what they're like themselves. So, if you have an extroverted individual, then they would probably feel more comfortable with an extroverted AI, and similar in other areas of personality. So that is one way in which this is really important, is just purely a trust question. But it goes further. Of course, how we behave and how we interact, how we make decisions, and so on, can be very culturally determined. So if people come from a certain culture that, for instance, is somewhat reserved in approaching problem solving, or another culture where you sort of throw the whole kitchen sink at it and then hope that something sticks and somehow you'll solve the problem. Like, these are culturally very different approaches, and these can be like rooted in regional differences, for instance. Then the expectations that people might have in terms of how AI interacts with them will be vastly different. And there again, it is important that AI can somehow adjust to these types of cultural differences. And then I think there is a final point where emotional intelligence is very important. And that is that a lot of what we expect of a person we're speaking with, or, in this specific example, an AI that we're interacting with, a lot of what we expect, we don't actually expect consciously. We have a whole range of subconscious expectations that, again, to a large extent, are culturally built, right? So we might not express directly that we disagree or are taken aback by a way in which a person or an AI is interacting with us. And if that person would be from the same culture, they would probably pick up on small changes in our demeanor and adjust to it. But if an AI doesn't do that, then, as you can see in real life as well, things can escalate pretty quickly. Except,
Absolutely.
now, of course, we're talking to a machine. So I think for AI to exhibit the form of emotional intelligence that we need, it probably actually also needs to be multimodal. So actually be able to see us, to listen to us, not just look at text that we type. Although I'm sure that like an all caps response is pretty clear sometimes.
Universal. Yeah.
Yeah. But it is basically emotional intelligence is a long story short here, basically needs to manifest itself in both directions. So the AI needs to be able to pick up on emotional cues coming from the user, but also at the same time needs to have sort of its own emotional intelligence and ability to express itself in such a way that then the user can pick up on the right things that the user expects. And that whole cycle of interaction, which is normal between humans and has shaped our entire evolutionary history as a social species, is mission critical for AI to function usefully with its human user base.
Yeah, absolutely. Covered many interesting things. A lot of communication is indeed isn't verbal, so
Right.
body language and things. So going forward, the AI needs to be able to take that and understand it in order to have a full range of the emotional experience and dealing with humans. So maybe going down, you mentioned personality traits and types. So why? I'm interested. What shapes the way we react to a given situation in the first place? If you put two different people in an identical situation, they will react or respond in a different way. And so I think personality and traits come in here. So what's the role of those?
So yeah, there is. I would say a person's personality can be classified in the form of different traits. In psychology, there is a broad literature on that, and then that personality manifests itself, right, and leads to a form of personality expression. And it's only through that expression that you can sort of probe what's going on in the black box that is the human mind, right? And that expression is then through which you can measure these traits, and eventually those traits might map to certain values and so on. But fundamentally, indeed, is you're looking at. I mentioned extroversion already earlier, right? As a typical sort of dimension along which you might be able to characterize personality. And if you go to the psychological literature, basically the basis for how personality expression is perceived today was laid nearly 40 years ago, actually, in the late 80s, in a paper by McRae and Costa, who proposed the Big Five personality framework. So basically, what they said is it demonstrated that there exist sort of five principal dimensions along which you can measure and characterize personality. So these are extroversion, as I mentioned. So basically, how outgoing a person is, conscientiousness. So that says something about how meticulous, attention to detail, these types of things show up in there. Agreeableness, which is to some extent the easygoingness, right? So the willingness to to accept other points of view, to maybe conform to these, or stick to one's own principles. There is what is called neuroticism, or maybe better represented as emotional instability, which is related to being unsettled, these types of things. Being easily distraught, depression is actually correlated with that trait as well. And then finally, openness to new experiences. So it's not openness in the way I think everybody today says, "Oh, I'm very open." It's not the type of open people mean in that context at all. It is literally the being open to new experiences. So that means that and that can be physical experiences, can be intellectual or mental experiences, doesn't matter. It's basically the willingness to try out new things. And that is basically reflected in that final dimension. So these 5 axes or dimensions basically represent a way of capturing personalities, and they're typically measured on like a 1 to 5 scale, and they actually give you a relatively fine-grained way of representing a very large number of different possible personalities, right?
Right.
And yeah, you're looking over at something like over 3,000 different archetypes if you only look at integer values. So this goes very quickly, and that way it's become possible to basically start handling personalities in a quantitative way,
Yeah.
because they all represent expressions, right? They all represent that view into the human mind to try and understand this.
Yeah. So it might be worth sort of poking into that a little bit and putting those sort of five, the big five in context with some, I don't know, some famous characters like Darth Vader would be a good one example of one extreme here. So in terms of openness, I presume he'd probably be a one. Um, and
Yeah,
conscientiousness would be a five. He follows orders. Well, I guess until he doesn't. Um, Extroversion, well, I'd say small, probably a one. Small talk is not his strong suit. And agreeableness, do the numbers go negative? I don't know, poking people for a laugh. And of course, like neuroticism would be a five. So this, giving an example of one person, a person that everyone's familiar with, placing their personality on this scale in an extreme way.
yeah.
But obviously that's extreme, and most of us hopefully lie slightly farther from those end points. And so so we've got now a metric of being able to put people. But how do you actually, how would you go about putting Darth Vader if you were brave enough and doing a test to find out what his personality was?
Yeah, so the traditional way to go about that is that there exist questionnaires that basically probe exactly these types of things. So it's basically what happens is test subjects are confronted or given a set of questions and are asked to indicate on like a scale of 1 to 5 to what extent they agree with the statement. And each individual question maps or is intended to probe one of these 5 dimensions. So then basically you collect all the results and you add them up and you average them and so on, and you end up for each dimension, you end up with its own individual score. Now, this is actually really important if you think about personality expression in the context of AI, right? Because I'm sure that, we've all interacted with simple forms of AI, like in LLMs and so on, where they all just kind of feel the same. Like one of the things that probably freaked me out the most when I started regularly interacting with AI was this sort of very artificial, dismissive, not dismissive, sorry, uh, so like very, very it's almost like you're recruiting a slave, right? Um, the AI just wants to please whatever the master says, and that is incredibly unrealistic. It's definitely not what you'd expect in the cultural background that I grew up in. And for that reason, it actually ended up being the personality of the AI that freaked me out. And if you want to do something about that and maybe make the AI more attuned, you can prompt forever. And I tried at the time, and it didn't really work yet. At the time, AI was not that sophisticated yet that you could actually meaningfully change its personality expression. Um, but it turns out, or at least that's a hypothesis that you can have, that if you find a way of quantifying personality and find sort of this common ground where the AI understands the quantitative system that you use to quantify that personality, then it might be possible to explain to the AI that it ought to behave in a certain way. So the fact that this type of quantitative standard exists for personality expression in psychological research means that there might also be a way of maybe making AI behave more deterministically along these dimensions and in a way that is more sort of consistent with what you might want or expect. So indeed, you could even go as far as saying, okay, if you find a way of solving that problem, then there is a way of creating an AI that represents Darth Vader in terms of its personality and its
Good luck.
decision making. Yeah, that would be great, wouldn't it?
Just not. And I guess because they can interact with the world now, there might be a little chokehold app that you could get. Yeah, I don't want him as my boss, I can tell you. But I think this segues quite nicely into the work that you've been doing on your research paper. So how did you go about bringing all this together in your research?
So yeah, at the time, we indeed encountered this point where if you look at the future and how things are developing now, what you're starting to see is the emergence of really swarms of AI agents. There is not just one AI agent that does everything, but increasingly AI agents are specializing. And at the same time, there exists a degree of competition. So often you have a lot more than one agent to do any given task. And what we realized very quickly is that if all of these agents operate exactly the same way, then there is nothing that makes them unique. They will all make exactly the same decisions. And what that means too is if you let them work together, they become like a flock with probably a relatively high degree of neuroticism because they all amplify, right? They all respond the same way. So if they all get scared, they all get scared, and now you have 1,000 AI agents that are scared. So you need a way, if you look at these sort of large groups, to differentiate between how each of the individuals in the swarm of agents responds. And if we just circle back briefly to the development of personality expression, maybe also in humans,
Absolutely, yeah.
it's not inconceivable that that is actually, and we alluded to that already, a source of high evolutionary fitness. Basically, imagine there is some crisis that overcomes a small community, then surely it is in the interest of that community that several or that a large set of individuals responds to that crisis in a wide variety of ways.
Yeah, because you don't know in advance which is going to be the optimal solution, and if everyone behaved in exactly the same way every time, then it would just take one time for it not to be the right option, and then see you later. Whereas,
That's
yeah,
right.
diversity was it's kind of evolutionary supported
Yes.
to make sense. Yeah,
Indeed. So if you now start thinking about a swarm of AI agents, you realize very quickly that you need to achieve a similar form of differentiation in personality expression. If you don't do that, then you get an unstable system. So that was for us effectively, other than like all of these questions of trust and so on that we were uh, talking about previously, these things are essential for basically creating a swarm of AI agents that is functional, that can respond well to changing circumstances, that is adaptive, and so on. So we decided that it was necessary to actually be able to have this broad variety of personalities among AI agents. And if you want to achieve that, you need to test, is it possible to set these personalities? And that brings us back indeed to the hypothesis I mentioned, which is we thought if there exists a quantitative framework for defining personalities, then it should be possible to steer these personality expressions. And that is what we did. So what we did is we created AI agents where each of them we pre-prompted with basically a big five personality template. So we explained to the agent, like, this is what big five is, just in case, it wasn't aware of that already from its training set, but of course it was, but it helped to reinforce that a little bit. And then we just gave numbers for each of the five dimensions. In conscientiousness, you are a 4. And, in agreeableness, you are a 1. And it turns out that then you can actually just let the AI agent take the test and collect the results and see what the agreement is between the input values for each of those personality dimensions and the output values. And what we found, to somewhat of a surprise, was outstanding agreement in most of these dimensions. Particularly extroversion and neuroticism were extremely well correlated. And yeah, that was to the point where it actually made us a little bit suspicious. It was near perfect in some cases. We tried this for several different flavors of the GPT family of models, ranging from 4.0 mini to, I think, O1 and O3 mini. Also 4.0 we tried. And there was some variance across these different models. As expected, maybe 4.0 mini was the worst, but then the more advanced versions were increasingly getting better. O3 mini was a little bit worse, actually, than O1, which was interesting. But what it made us do too, like this excellent correlation, has made us wonder, okay, is the AI maybe cheating now? Is it cheating? Because I could imagine that the AI knows, like, okay, I've just been told that I should have 4 in conscientiousness and 1 in agreeableness. And I'm just going to spot, okay, is this a question that will probe agreeableness? Okay, then I'll just answer 1, because of course I have 1 in agreeableness. And if that's true, of course, it's gaming the system. Then it's not arriving at a personality expression based on just reasoning, but just based on being pre-programmed and recognizing, oh, this question clearly probes this dimension. And if that were true, then in a real life example where maybe the situation is not as clear cut as in a questionnaire that is specifically designed to probe this question, then of course the agent would fail to accurately express itself. So we tried 2 things to try and pin this down. One is we actually looked at the variance of scores that the agents, or replies that the agents gave to questions. So we looked at, for instance, if we just take the conscientiousness example again, right, where I said, okay, we take an agent where the conscientiousness trait has a value of 4. We looked at all of the conscientiousness questions and I was like, okay, do these actually get 4 as the answer for all of them? And the answer is no, they don't. There is non-zero variance. The mean is very close to 4, but there is considerable question-to-question variance. So that is already giving us some confidence that the agent is not cheating. But also, if you repeat the same experiment multiple times, it turns out it doesn't always give the same answer to the same question. That is very human behavior, right? Like, we don't do that either. Our personality expression is, I think, extraordinarily inconsistent. Like, sure, we have these broad guidelines and so on, but we're affected by how we got up in the morning. There is nothing you can do about it. Is why sometimes even good friends get like upset from an interaction they have with one another just because that's not how you behaved yesterday. It is inconsistency is our norm. Now, it turns out that, even though inconsistency is our norm, by and large, exists some consistency in personality expression. And the same happened to be the case for these agents. And then finally, what we tried is for each of those different sort of base models, like the different GPT flavors that I mentioned, we also tried requiring each of them to not just answer with a numeric value to each question, indicating like how much do you agree with this statement, right? Um, one statement might be this is one that measures extroversion, but one statement would be I'm the life of the party, right? And somebody scoring high on extroversion would probably answer it with a 5, and an introvert will probably answer with a 1, and everything in between, of course. Now, what we added to just that numeric answer is we also required the agents to motivate their answers and actually give a linguistic addendum to that number and say like, okay, what do you actually, what makes you answer this? What makes you give this numeric answer? And it turns out that the numeric answers were, and this is of course is a subjective form of evaluation. It's not an objective or quantitative form, but the motivations were highly consistent with the numeric answers. So there was a clear connection between a form of reasoning and the actual numeric answer. And that was true too if the numeric answer deviated from the sort of the personality setting, right? So if the example we're using where the agent has a conscientiousness trait of 4 and it replies to a conscientiousness question with maybe a 2. And it turns out its motivation was actually fine. It was consistent with the 2. So that degree of sort of reasoning-based consistency is extremely suitable.
So you've now created these agents that arrive at this deterministic personality expression, and you're now in a position, it seems to me, that you can create swarms of these agents with different personalities. Now, I understand from reading the paper that this would make the agent swarm so much more efficient and sort of robust in an evolutionary sense.
Yeah, that's right. I think there is basically, I was alluding to that a little bit earlier, is that the stability of a system is just much greater if there is greater variety in personality expressions. And the reasoning behind that is that basically AI agents are decision-making machines, right? They basically take some input data in text form, and based on that, draw conclusions or make decisions in one way or another. And personality expression here is not just influencing basically what you as a user perceive from that agent, but also directly influences the reasoning of the agent itself, right? We just established that the personality expression is the result of a reasoning based process. So then also it means that the personality expression can affect and influence that reasoning based process itself. So if we now indeed go back to the example of, say, a crisis where you have a large population of individual agents responding to that crisis, then if there is more variety, effectively what it does is it increases the stability of the population at large. If they're all the same and all respond the same way, you're looking at an amplified, unstable system. And if they're all different, then you get a lot more sort of stability in that system. Again, here there is literature on that, which basically says you can look at a population with behavioral variety such and then heterogeneity that these can be adaptive and stable at the same time. So you basically, what you do is you arrive at a system that evolves more slowly and adapts more slowly when you have this greater differentiation between individuals within that system. So just purely from a population dynamics perspective, it is really a desirable property of the population to have, that personality differentiation. Now, for AI agents, there is no reason why that wouldn't be the case as well, right? This is true in animals or in humans.
Very generic.
Extremely general. So there is no reason why that would be different for AI agents. And that means that indeed is the agents themselves become more evolutionarily robust as a population. It means that that population can also probably evolve and develop in the way that is best suited for the task that it fulfills. And in doing so, then obviously it also becomes more efficient. So, yeah, for me, this is a form of sort of meta development. I can imagine, maybe to give a concrete example, that conditions change. So let's say we have a set of AI agents that is active in disaster prevention and response, right? So basically some autonomous systems that ingest some data, predictions from Allora, let's say, and based on those, come up with strategies to respond to a hurricane warning or to a wildfire warning. And I could well imagine that the response to these sort of types of sort of crisis situations, under certain sets of circumstances, requires a high degree of conscientiousness. Like, okay, let's really work through all the details before we arrive at a decision. Whereas in other situations, it might be that conscientiousness is actually a negative trait here, where you have to respond
Yeah.
now, and
Yeah.
it better be a knee-jerk response or none at all, because everybody will be dead if you don't act now.
Yeah.
So that differentiation is important, and it's hard to tell in advance what personality type is the most suitable and responds best.
Yeah, and I guess you need
So
some kind of feedback loop in here
yeah,
to know what in that circumstance was like in the real
that's
world for evolution.
yes, yeah. So it's the evolutionary feedback loop that solves that basically, and that's the reason that in AI agents this is just as necessary as in humans. Is we don't know in advance what we need, so we better let the population figure it out.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really excellent example of that. I think so. Slightly differently here, we've touched a bit about, I guess, user engagement. So how do you think this same principle can this personality expression in AI agents? How can that actually enhance user trust and engagement?
So yeah, that's another. We touched on that before. Indeed, is how important this personality expression is uh, from a user's cultural background and so on. And this is indeed, yeah, basically it's mission critical. You are looking at a problem or problem situation where AI is becoming increasingly prevalent in society and is used under a wide variety of circumstances.
Yeah,
I can totally imagine that a digital tutor, like an AI tutor, that is teaching a kid something, should have a very different personality expression, probably more along the lines of, say, what LLMs currently do, right?
yeah,
Than an AI agent used in military training, or maybe a personal coach of a hedge fund CEO. Like these require completely different profiles, and in one case, in the first case about an AI tutor, um, probably a certain degree of agreeableness is a good idea.
yeah. To get on with the
But
student.
yeah,
Yeah,
and if you're looking at military use, or let's say a personal coach of a hedge fund CEO, I would say that low agreeableness is probably better,
yeah,
because every opinion, every view ought to be challenged.
yeah,
So Yeah, this again sort of relates to the expectations somebody might have of
Like
how.
that might change with culture as well, like in a different.
Totally. Yep. Very culturally dependent. And yeah, that basically means that you're again touching on this degree of expectation. How do you expect an AI agent to function? And what you see is that it is, on the one hand, indeed, that this trust question relates to communication, although communication and personality expression are actually not the same thing. They're different. They're actually independent dimensions that you can consider. But if we just focus on personality expression here, the trust is also in, okay, I don't care how you communicate, but I just gave you these instructions, or I just gave you this information. I expect you to do something with this information. I expect you to undertake certain actions
And doing a
based
particular
on this.
and do it in a way. Yeah.
Yes, based on this information. And then we're not talking about communication at all. It's again just concrete action taking
Yeah.
that follows directly from this personality expression. So the ability to build trust and start depending on the actions of an AI agent are very intimately related to, on the one hand, the suitability of the AI agent's personality expression for the task and the role that it fulfills, on the one hand. And on the other hand, also how these actions then align with the expectations of the user.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot to be said. For example, things like small talk, like
Yeah,
the studies I believe show that people that engage in small talk and get on well, then the subsequent interaction. So for you go to your doctor, and that process of the small talk with your doctor of relaxing you before doing something that you might not be expecting. All of this that's it's the building of trust. Is that yes, I get this person, I understand where they're coming from. You're more likely to engage with them in a trust based way, and without that, I guess the AI being able to understand emotions and have the flexibility to, different agents with different personalities operating in different ways. I mean, it's critical if we want to have like a really sort of properly trust based relationship like we would in a human to human interaction.
yep, yeah, absolutely.
So I guess this is all well and good, and it seems rosy, but I suspect that we're not perfect. That the AI agents and the personality and so on is not perfect. So what do you think are the sort of the limitations of the current models, particularly around stable and believable personality traits? I mean, I imagine they might be able to get it right once or twice, but if they go off and say something weird, then you lose that level of trust, even if you built it up.
Yeah, sounds very human, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So I actually I realize in the literature there is actually some concern about stability and consistency of personality expression and so on. Well, for one, I think that's in part solved by the paper that we just published, and the study that we did is, it turns out things are deterministic to the point, and reproducible to the point that you can actually encode personality types very well. But on the other hand, too, what I mentioned earlier is that there exists this sort of question to question variance in the questionnaires that we let the AI agents take. And that type of variance is why I said it's very human. We ourselves act, even though we might have a certain personality trait, we act in broad consistency with that personality trait, but that doesn't mean that we have machine precision.
Well, absolutely not. I mean, take the same thing at 7 in the morning before a coffee and at 4 o'clock after the workday. We'll take the same situation and we'll act. Our
That's
actions will be completely different. Have our personality changed? Probably not in the global picture, but we certainly behaved or reacted to a situation in a different way. So that
yeah.
is, I think, just part of naturally being human.
Part of that is somewhat encoded by the neuroticism dimension, of course, right? But
Yeah.
that's not all. That's absolutely not all. You can have just general variance along any of those dimensions, and I don't think the variance along any of the other dimensions is controlled by the neuroticism dimension. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
But there is definitely some degree of crosstalk there. No, but we're more interested in trying to answer your question. We're more interested in maybe are there systematic issues in terms of how you can define these personality types and their expression in AI agents. And what we saw in the experiments that we did is that the openness dimensions, the openness to basically learn new experiences or engage in new experiences, that dimension was, extremely biased in the current generation of AI agents. So basically, what we found is that without exception, all of our agents had a score of at least 3, and many of them actually in excess of 4. And that was despite the fact that the initial sort of specification of these traits for these agents went as low as 1. So one way or another, they all love to go skydiving.
Right.
And this is probably something related to their pre-prompting. It might be related to the fact that, of course, they are commercial products, and they have a certain goal, and that is to engage with the user in any type of discussion as long as it's legal. And that is undoubtedly something that impacted this. But you could have the same type of reasoning about agreeableness, and there we didn't find that type of anomaly. We were able to generate agents that were highly non-agreeable, and it just for one reason or another, openness was very, very strongly affected by this. So yeah, that is definitely is an area for improvement. You just eliminates one of these 5 dimensions, or compresses its dynamic range by cuts it in half. But I don't necessarily think that is a fundamental shortcoming. It's something you can keep in mind and play with. It means we can't probably create the perfect Darth Vader clone, but it's a start.
Yeah. So, to what extent have we overcome this problem, I guess, of brittleness in the way that models respond to things? So they understand, they have a personality, but in fine details they don't get it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel that the experiments we did, where we made the agents also motivate their answers,
Yeah.
and the consistency between their motivations and the answers themselves, were actually very promising in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe earlier generations of LLMs and agents were weaker in this regard, but I think the current generation actually does relatively well. Now, of course, there are still inconsistencies every now and then, but these are not sufficiently severe to disrupt the general coherence between input and output personality expression. And
Yeah.
that is the most important thing in the end.
Absolutely. And so with new generations of models, perhaps taking these into account, that this is all surmountable, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so let's be optimistic and say that is going to happen. What do you think the potential risks are of either misaligned or overly human-like personalities in these agents?
Well, yeah, there are always risks involved when you create autonomous systems, and AI agents are autonomous systems. I I personally do not believe there exists great risk in terms of just the communication of AI agents. Let me put it this way: if we were to create the Darth Vader AI agent, which has Darth Vader's personality traits, and all that agent would do was communicate with humans, then what's the worst thing it can do? It can traumatize somebody, maybe, but that would require rather extreme engagement on the user's behalf. Um, there is not much that can happen, right? We live in this society where we feel that we need to be in control of absolutely everything, and that leads to a form of risk aversion that is, sometimes a little bit delusional. Um, Fundamentally, if you are looking at AI agents that only communicate, then there is relatively little that can go wrong. Now, of course, depending on a personality type, an agent can be manipulative. It can engage in, for instance, if you have an AI agent that engages in psychological counseling, then maybe you want to be a little bit more careful about the personality type
Yeah.
that you use there, right? So there were definitely, some sort of specific
Yeah, and
niches.
obvious things like if it's with kids, the tutor example you gave earlier, you probably want to have some limits on the sort of topics that the child would be able to ask,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Well, yeah, you don't let a 3-year-old watch the Terminator either. So
Exactly. Yeah.
no, I don't think we need to be like, we don't need to be draconic about anything that
Absolutely.
is related to personality expression in AI agents when it comes to like safety, guardrails, ethics,
Yeah,
and so
exactly. It's common
on.
sense.
And sort of this myopic view of a controlled society is just, sometimes leading to a little bit of a misguided perspective there. However, all of that changes the moment that you give agents access to other systems. So the agents don't just communicate, but they also engage in actions. And this is again coming back to this sort of duality or orthogonality I mentioned earlier between personality type and style of communication. So we did an extra set of experiments in our study, and also discussed these in the paper, where we fine-tuned, so we retrained one of the GPT models, 4.0, to, in a style of communication, be maximally offensive. And it worked great. It turns out that this is entirely independent of its personality expression. So it's reasoning.
Okay.
So it can be offensive and agreeable at the same time. It'll just, I don't
That's
know, be very sarcastic in terms
right.
of, and
Okay.
then be offensive that way, right? But still be very agreeable. This is possible. And again, that is interesting because it means that you can control both of these. So if we're really worried about communication, we can probably fine tune the communication, still retain the sort of core essence of different personality types. This also means that I can create um, um, appropriate personality types for maybe more real world interaction, not just communication, not pure language based, but actually AI agents capable of engaging in actual real world actions
Yeah.
through
Actions.
interfaces like, the MCP model context protocol and so on. Is like agents can control anything now, right? So you can create appropriate personality types for agents to engage with external systems. And those agents can at the same time be maximally offensive and so on. I don't care. The point where we need the guardrails, where the risks exist, is when the personality type is misaligned with the real world actions the agent can take.
Yeah.
That is where the risks lie. And that is the only part of this entire discussion where caution is needed. Is basically you in agent space, the personality type affects the decision making process of the agent. That's a strength. If you have a large number of agents, it allows the population to experiment and figure out what works best. But if you're relying on individual agents and those agents happen to have a personality type that is misaligned with what is needed, so you know let's hope this never happens, but let's say AI agents are used in a military context where they have access to weaponry, then they better have a pretty low neuroticism score, and hopefully also a pretty high agreeableness and high conscientiousness.
Okay.
And
So,
I would also want them to have a low openness to new experiences, right? Not oh, I wonder what would happen if I press this red button. Now that would be generally would be a very bad idea. So this is the type of examples, of course, is out there, is extremely hypothetical, but I'm using it as a point of reference to illustrate that yeah, you want basically these types of dimensions become the variables that you can play with in terms of trying to steer behavior. And of course, there's all the regular pre-prompting where you just give text-based instructions, right? Is you can do this, you can do that, and so on. But when used correctly, these personality types can actually be a very powerful tool to steer behavior for good and for bad. That's true for any technology. And yeah, that is why, especially through MCP type interfaces with real world systems, is that's where the caution is needed.
yeah, so being concrete, where would you say, if I was to push you there, what would you say the ethical boundaries we should consider when we're designing this?
Um,
None.
Not none. And
Mhm.
no, I mean, as I just mentioned, we absolutely
Yeah, we
should not
should do.
consider no
Just
boundaries, right?
yeah. But just
Um,
this is a big space, and I mean we'd need more than a podcast to cover this. But just in terms of general principles, I know people are thinking along these lines. There's governments, they're thinking about this at the moment. What are your
well,
thoughts?
yeah, but governments are overshooting, right? Because on the one hand, because they might not be necessarily sufficiently literate when it comes to these types of questions, right? It does require a high degree of domain expertise to make meaningful judgment about these types of questions. Um, and this is a very rapidly evolving ecosystem where it actually takes a huge amount of effort to be fully up to speed with
Yeah,
all of these things. So that's delicate. No, I think it is actually what I just mentioned is there should be boundaries on the moment you introduce personality expression as a variable in AI agents, then there should be boundaries on personality expression when the personality expression can have real world impact.
oh yeah, okay. So it's that mapping that we need to understand.
Exactly. Is that mapping? I really don't think anybody should care much about modes of communication, styles of communication, and so
Yeah,
on. Uh, the, I think boundaries when it comes to that can be draconic. Again, this not talking about applications that involve children, for instance, right? So there are children and also groups and adults that are maybe more vulnerable. There you need to pay attention to these things. But for just general adults, there is no need to police AI agent communication. Um, the same way that there were movies, books, or any other form, computer games of entertainment that are being produced that I think are probably more transgressive than an AI agent can reasonably be. But it is still true that if you create autonomous systems, because that is really what we're talking about
yeah,
here, if you create autonomous systems, then these autonomous systems are uh, the assistants of humans
yeah.
or are designed to support humans. And then value alignment is important, right? Fundamentally, these systems should pursue the same goals as the people they are serving.
Yeah.
This is basically is a
Fundamental.
fundamental requirement.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we haven't really touched on this, but do you think there's anything? So the current status of the models. You can imagine a nefarious actor out there with a completely different LLM that is, designed in a different way. Like, how does that? Yeah, I guess maybe this is going too far off the point. But you can imagine someone creating an LLM with
Mhm.
nefarious purposes and putting it out there.
Mhm.
Do these still the personality things, would that still apply in the same way? I guess you'd have to run the similar sorts of tests on any new model that came in, and benchmark, and then do the benchmark to the mapping to this. Is that how you'd see this, I guess, process working?
Well, you wouldn't know in advance. You wouldn't know, for a different model. You don't know if personality expression is as deterministic as in
Absolutely.
the set of models that we tested here,
Yeah.
right? So I can imagine that maybe for some models the correlation between input and between input personality and output personality expression might break down.
Yeah.
Then then it becomes harder to set meaningful boundaries, right?
Yes.
If
Yeah.
it's basically you increase your variance. That is what happens.
Yeah.
And if you increase your variance, then very slowly the personality expression becomes non-deterministic. And if it's non-deterministic, then there is no control. Then it is just arbitrary, and that is true, right?
Yeah.
But then it's because it's arbitrary. It's also no longer reproducible,
Yeah.
and because it isn't reproducible, then that means it's not very useful either from, say, an evolutionary perspective, or because
Yes.
for evolutionary utility and fitness, the personality expression needs to be reproducible. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
there's no
Yeah.
point.
It's just chaotic and random, and
Yes.
no one's. I don't think anyone particularly. Yeah, it might be fun for a little bit if you meet someone that's completely all over the shop, but you don't get things done. It's not very effective and efficient. So I think in an evolutionary sense, such a model would not last long.
No,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah. So, as so, do we need regulation or norms around AI personalities, especially as become more prevalent in public-facing roles? I'm thinking things like regulatory gaps here, and
Yeah, well, yeah, I'd say that's a bit early. We just published the paper.
but okay,
But of course, we're not the only ones who've been working on this, and this is an active field of study. But having said that, um, I think it's very early to put legal limits or norms on personality expression. What is important is, we are familiar, of course, already with, let's say, AI hallucinating, and maybe defining a single sort of a single truth or a single reality.
yeah,
And if everybody starts relying on the AI to provide sort of that point of reference, then that in itself is a development that you can ask questions about, just as a society. Is that something that's desirable? Because obviously one of the things it does is it undermines critical thinking. It undermines diversity of thought, which in itself is one of the reasons that we want this differentiation in personality expressions, to enable the diversity of reasoning within the population and increase the evolutionary fitness of our pool of AI agents. Well, then we should obviously also ask the same question about the pool of humans and say, okay, can we maintain the evolutionary fitness of the pool of humans as well, to sufficiently differentiate between their personalities, points of view, and so on. So that means that if you go back and say, okay, now instead of looking at how AI agents might manifest themselves, we think about how humans might manifest themselves in a world where AI agents are the norm and AI personalities, therefore, are the norm. Then the regulatory norm that I think instinctively most governments would look at would be a unified one that says, okay, AI agents should do, and then there is a list of things that probably says, okay, personality should be this, should be that, should be that. The truth is, as I think is pretty clear at this point from our conversation, that the most trustworthy and effective and probably also useful system from a human perspective is one where regulation actually promotes uh, um, personality differentiation rather than homogenizing it.
Yeah.
Basically, algorithmic homogeneity is, in general, in a world that relies more and more on algorithms, is undesirable because of the same destabilizing effects that I earlier was discussing within the AI realm. Is if you create systems that all respond the same way, then that destabilizes the system actually. And the same is true for human society. So if we rely on AI agents, then we would want them to be differentiated. I
Yeah.
think um, that is the most important thing. So if there is any form of regulatory intervention, I would argue it should be focused at preserving that differentiation. That is probably the wisest thing that we can do.
Yeah. But I guess the one thing that I can imagine that regulators would be keen on is, so say they were to go down that route, they would want some degree of openness or opacity or
Mm.
visibility to understand the process by which these things are happening, so they can it's basically it's clear and open to everyone what they're using and why and how it was generated. Do you think is that?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know. If I meet a person, I don't know in advance what their agreeableness score is. So I I don't necessarily think that that is needed either. But again, I mean, this is a very personal opinion, right? I just think that okay, if we accept the fact that we can meet a stranger in the street that we need to have a conversation with, and sometimes, like even if you, let's say, you go to a doctor or you go to a psychologist or you just get any form of counseling, doesn't matter. You don't know in advance, and not even after the fact either, what their personality type is. You have no idea. Sure, you talk to them, you get a feel. Why can't we do the same thing with an AI agent?
Well, I
I
suppose
don't
that
think.
the fact that they're a doctor in the first place means that there have been quite a few hurdles that they've had to go through, which means they're probably pretty conscientious. They're probably so there's a self selection effect in there to some extent. So when you go to see a doctor, you expect someone that's not going to be sitting there like, oh, what do you want? I think that there is a selection effect in there. This doesn't have anything to do with regulation, but
No, I mean, I think that can be true in part, but obviously we're looking at broad distribution functions, right? When you say something like that.
yeah,
So there is no guarantee that your doctor doesn't have a conscientiousness trait of one, right? There's no guarantee for that. I'm interested in these type of distributions, and I'm sure
yeah,
doctors, have been, like medical doctors, have been tested on this.
that'd be interesting.
But yeah, I don't know the literature on that one.
Yeah, nor do I. That's interesting. So I think one thing that I've had in the back of my mind throughout all of this is that so you've got a deterministic personality traits, and so in my head, I'm just assuming that these things are fixed in time. Now we know in humans that that's absolutely not the case. That our personalities change over time as we go through, particularly as we go through adolescence, early 20s, and there's quite well known traits in the way that the big five will tend to go in particular directions with time. Do you think is there a possibility as the agents evolve and grow and interact that their personality traits will could change in a similar way?
Yeah, I mean, definitely for the population at large, right? Through the sort of evolutionary
Yeah,
processes that I mentioned.
but in an individual one.
But an individual one, I suppose if you allow the parameters to change, right? So the evolutionary traits, but even then, I think it's important to distinguish between personality or personality expression and these traits on the one hand, and maybe persona. So basically,
Mm.
the individual that is built by the combination of these personality traits, their expression, and the type that you build together, with maybe the history of the individual, its background, its values. We've not really touched on values much, right? But
Mhm.
values differ from a personality type. Like you can have a personality type or two people with the same personality type and wildly different values in terms of just philosophy, politics, all kinds of things. And of course, in as you mentioned, for largely hormonal reasons, but also a little bit based on experience, of course, personality type can evolve quite considerably in humans. Um, if you algorithmically define a personality type in an AI agent, then the only way to make that evolve is by adjusting that algorithmic definition, right? So it just we decided to take a quantitative approach here, and then you need to change the numbers. But I think even with those numbers being fixed, I think that if you create an AI agent with an extremely large context window in which it can basically record its entire existing history,
Yeah.
then you can definitely get a manifestation of its persona that is strongly evolving with time.
Yeah.
And this will directly interface with indeed its emotional intelligence, with its potentially the variance of its personality expression over time, how that variance itself and the personality expression itself too, of course, made it interact with the world, and then of course how all of these experiences end up um, influencing its behavior over time altogether. There was no reason why that would not happen. And there was also no reason, of course, why you wouldn't potentially allow these sort of personality types, the initial traits, to change over time.
Okay.
I can totally see that too. It's just
So how
you
do you
would then
balance
have, sorry.
that? So how do you balance that sort of the determinism and personality expression on the one hand with the need for flexibility and adaptation?
Um, I think to a large extent, because we're talking about swarms of AI agents, there's safety in numbers, right? So the adaptation, the adaptability of the agent pool at large, I think will fulfill a similar role as it does in humans.
Yeah.
A human extrovert will not say, "Oh, my evolutionary conditions currently require me to become an introvert, so I will become an introvert." That doesn't happen,
Yeah.
right? So instead, if society demands introverts, there is a whole set of them waiting,
Yeah.
and society will turn to those. So I think that is in practice how that'll work. Um, and we haven't quantified this yet, right? But I keep coming back to this sort of question to question variance in personality
Yeah.
expression, and also some variance over stochasticity over time, uh, where there exists scatter on the relation between input and output personality. And at least intuitively to me, if I look at the results that we published in the paper, um, I have the feeling that the magnitude of that variance is actually relatively similar to that in humans. And a great follow-up study would be to actually try and compare these more directly, because it's something that you can quantify and actually quite easily measure.
Mm.
Um, and that in itself should probably shed a little bit more light on this question. I think that's an interesting point for follow-up
Yeah.
work.
Absolutely. So, do you think so? Emotional intelligence in these AI agents is that going to improve how they coordinate and specialize when using sort of decentralized intelligence like Allora?
Yeah, I think it will actually hugely improve things. So the way you can think about the interface between AI agents and Allora is that networks or systems like Allora provide a form of quantitative intelligence, right? You basically constantly provide quantitative inference feeds, numbers, or at least in the current form. It can be numbers or labels or probabilities, can all be fed by current Allora topics. And agents are really just as much as humans might be, or other sort of more controlled decision systems, are a decision making system that can operate using these quantitative inference feeds. I mentioned the example of disaster prevention and response earlier, right? Where, if you want to know if there is a wildfire coming, then there's a whole variety of sensors. Based on those sensors, there's forecasting about spreading rates, temperatures,
Wind speed.
drought,
Yeah.
wind speed, exactly. And you need this sort of coordination mechanism, which is the AI agent, to to combine and coordinate and organize all of these different data feeds into concrete strategies, into concrete decisions, and just general decision making processes, and their communication to the end user base, which might be private individuals, might be governments, might be companies. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Now, if all of that is organized by one system, let's say, and now I'm not talking about some rigid rule-based system, no, but by, let's say, an AI agent, right?
Yeah.
So something that can somewhat dynamically, through reasoning, arrive at decision making. Then, if that is always the same boilerplate AI agent that we see today, then yeah, again, you're looking only at one possible perspective on the problem.
Yeah.
What you would want in practice is something very different. Is you would want the swarm, and you would want to get all of those different perspectives and have a form of feedback loop that allows you to reach the best possible perspective for the problem at hand. And that is why emotional intelligence and personality expression differentiation in AI agents is so important for that sort of translation layer that can exist on quantitative intelligence systems like Allora. It's basically, if you ask um, a room full of, say, 100 of the smartest students, PhD students in the world, okay, here are some data about wildfire risk and so on in this environment at this moment in time. Here are all the data. What would you do? If these are really the 100 best students in the world, I'm sure they're capable of high level critical thinking and so on. I bet you they would not arrive at the same conclusion. They would come up with a wide variety of different strategies.
Depending
That's
on
why
their
there's
risk appetite, on how much they
yeah,
value, how quickly they think they could get out. There's so many factors that would their particular decision at a particular should we
exactly.
abandon or not would be dependent on so many things that are out with the data.
Indeed, and they're all that good in a different way,
Yeah.
in a way that just connects differently, indeed, to a large extent, their personality, and that differentiation is exactly the same thing that then allows AI agents in similar settings to perform better than we might have had accomplished otherwise. So yeah, I think the ability of these decision-making machines that AI agents really are, to meaningfully translate quantitative data into real-world use cases and decision-making with real-world consequences. That is the reason that, personality expression in AI agents is one of the most important frontiers, where we're starting to deliver this sort of unique form of machine intelligence that can forecast, that can anticipate, and catch people before they fall to a constructive set of applications in the real world. It's really where everything comes together.
So what do you think this personality expression in AI agents tells us about where the technology is going to be headed over the next decade? I think you're kind of alluding there. I'm going to push you on that. Where's this all going in 10 years?
10 years is a long time in this field.
Things are moving so quickly. So I'm pushing that's probably
Yeah.
a terribly unfair question, but give it a go.
No, um, So I think that we often think of personality as this sort of nice to have feature in AI, maybe something cosmetic or useful just for the user experience. And this has mostly been guided by this idea that AI is really just sort of a glorified chatbot, right? But as we move forward in towards this world with more autonomous agents that have a greater variety of ways in which they can take real world actions, personality expression actually becomes essential. It's how agents differentiate themselves, is how they interact with human users, as we discussed, how they coordinate with one another, but also just indeed how they arrive at the decisions that they make. And if we then don't have variety in personality expression, then we risk a kind of algorithmic homogeneity. And then we end up in a future where we have trivially interchangeable systems that really fail to adapt or evolve in meaningful ways. And that is kind of the deeper point. Personality isn't just surface level expression, it's a way to meaningfully encode behavioral variety, to enable trust, and generate a whole breadth of behavioral strategies that you need for evolutionary fitness within an ecosystem of AI agents, of humans, or any reasoning set of entities. And if agents are going to collaborate, to compete, and to improve over time, then we need these frameworks that allow for expressive and persistent and uh, interpretable personality differences. So then the challenge going forward isn't just about building smarter agents, it's about designing and creating this environment where intelligence and behavior can take on distinct forms, remain aligned with our values, of course, but as said, values are independent of personality expression. And then these can continue to evolve in meaningful and interpretable ways. And over the next decade, I expect enormous acceleration in exactly this direction. And we'll see if I'm right,
Yeah,
but
well
I'm
done.
pretty confident.
That's a nice picture. I think that's wow. Covered lots. I think that's a really good place to wrap up today's discussion on this bright future on where this is heading. And let's see in 10 years whether we got it right. And that's indeed where emotional intelligence and personality ends up in AI agents. So thanks again, Diederik. I really enjoyed that. We covered some really interesting things there. Um, yeah, so exploring this personality expression, I think on my own take in here is it really the bottom line is a critical way to enhance the trustworthiness and usability of AI, and how this variety helps agents distinguish themselves and adapt behaviorally. How their behavior adapts over time. Um, I'm interested to see where the ethical boundaries go. I think we need to be mindful of this as we go forward. So lots to think about. This is an incredibly fast moving area. And if you'd like to dive deeper, please do check out our research on Allora.network and stay tuned for the next episode of the Allora Research Fireside Chats.